I will now move to Patrick Heather. We already started talking about the internal market. Of course, having an integrated and resilient internal market will be a very important factor for energy security, as no system is really safe in isolation. But where do we stand? What is the state of play with the integration of the energy market at the moment, the EU energy market?
Bună ziua. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Aspen Institute, for inviting me once again. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a short presentation for you, which I hope will stimulate the discussion at the end. And this is based on the research that I've done for the paper that I am writing at the moment for the Oxford Institute. It was meant to be published last autumn, but my consultancy work got in the way. So it should be published in the next couple of months, something like that. Just to set the scene, the paper I wrote in 2012 was in the context of the change in gas contract price formation, and I posed the question, will European gas hubs provide a true reference point? I concluded then, and it is quite obvious now with hindsight, that they already do provide a reference point. There are two hubs in particular that provide a reference point. So my current paper is reviewing those hubs and is indeed looking across all of the EU member states and the potential to have hubs everywhere. And that is therefore in the context of the EU's aim for a single energy market in gas. I specialize in gas. And the question here I'm posing is, will European gas target model become reality? This is a map I have created, the latest version of it. It is my interpretation of the European gas scene at the moment in 2015. You will notice on the right-hand side I'm introducing a traffic light color coding, which I use throughout a lot of my tables. And later in the presentation there are some slides with a lot of information on. I'm not expecting you to read all the information, just look at the color. And the general rule is green is good, orange is fair, and red is poor. So in this case, there are two what I call mature hubs. I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by that. And they are the British MBP and the Dutch TTF. There are a couple of active hubs, a handful of poor hubs. They are trading, but not in any great volumes. And then quite a few hubs in red at the moment. These are very little trading or little activity or none at all at the moment. And then in blue I've put the hubs that are planned, including some regional projects. But really the point here is that not all the hubs are developing in the same way or at the same speed, and there are at the moment only two mature hubs in Europe. So maybe if I just leave that map up there and just talk to you about the development of the hubs. I mean, the most developed part in Europe is in that northwest European section, but it is also the area that has the most disparity between mature, poor, and illiquid hubs. Then you have the Central European region, which in my opinion is the one showing the most promise at the moment for further development over the coming years, both in infrastructure and in market development. And then most of Eastern Europe is still heavily dependent on Russian gas supplies, arriving through the historic network of transit pipelines. This is now a rather old infrastructure that needs modernizing as well as adding to. Their local gas networks are generally poor, and in particular there is a major shortcoming, and that is in north-south connectivity. Again, there are some projects, there are indeed several projects to improve that, but as I say, Europe is not one homogeneous gas market, neither in infrastructure nor in political desire to change. There are hurdles involved, and these are hurdles that still exist today despite a lot of work from both the Commission, the regulators, ENSOG, and the market participants, but there is still work to be done. Liquidity and transparency are key to the development of successful markets, and in particular, I find this as a researcher still very frustrating. There are no defined measures or criteria for data dissemination in particular, let's say. And just to give an example, across Europe, some TSOs give their figures in volumes in energy, others give their volumes in quantity, and others do a conversion but don't tell you what the CV is. So it is very difficult when you're trying to compare country to country. These may not sound like very important things in the general scheme. The gas is moving, it is being sold, it's being bought, it's being consumed. But actually it is very important if you want to try and achieve a more unified system across the whole of the member states. Physical connectivity is absolutely key. If you do not have physical connectivity, you then have physical constraints. I will give as an example, a very good example, is the major constraint between the northern and southern hubs in France, and it is fine for 80% of the time, but at 20% of the time when there are problems in delivering gas through that restricted pipeline, then you see enormous price differences between the two areas, and that is within one country. So you can imagine, and as I say, particularly in Eastern Europe where the north-south connectivity is poor, there is great difficulty there in achieving similar prices even in adjoining markets. And finally, I think it is very important, political willingness and cultural attitudes. It's all very well for the Commission to publish an energy package, to have directives that the member states, even if they have voted positively on, it does not necessarily mean that you will have the same outcome in every country, because the way these directives are interpreted politically and also the cultural attitude, whether people in those countries want to trade or not, have a great bearing on the development of successful gas hubs. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples actually that point that out. This is from the latest International Gas Union survey that was published just a few weeks ago, and it is their price survey, supply, demand and price survey for 2014 across the world globally, but I've picked out here on Europe. And in the top left, in the left-hand side of this slide, you will see the European, all of Europe, and the definition, if you want to look, is in the light blue underneath of what they call Europe. It includes Turkey. And there you can see here that there's a different color bar for each of the last 7 years, and you can see the progress of how oil indexation in contract price formation, which is the first set of bars, that has gone down significantly. And then the next set of bars is gas on gas pricing, and you can see that there's almost an inverse increase there. On the right-hand side is a table that I've constructed from the various figures throughout the survey, and the point there is if you look at the yellow figures, Europe total, you can see how that in 2014 there's just over 30% oil indexation and just about 60% gas on gas pricing. And that is really quite a significant move from only 5-6 years ago, where it was almost the other way round. Now though, if you look at the European regions, you can see enormous differences. And this really is my point, that at the moment, there is great disparity across Europe in many respects. And this is focusing on price formation, but that is also indicative of the way that the markets, the traded hubs are developing as well. So you can see in the top left-hand corner, Northwest Europe, 90-odd% now of contracts are priced gas on gas, market pricing, and that has gone up significantly from only about 30% 7 years ago. In Mediterranean Europe, the level of oil indexation is reducing. The level of gas on market pricing is increasing, but that is mainly Italy. Almost exclusively Italy, the little blue bar there for 2014. Then you look on the right-hand side, and you have Central Europe and Southeast Europe. I'm going to first of all look at Southeast Europe, and there is a domination in the price formation by regulated prices, which are the columns in the middle of that graph. That is the type of price formation that dominates, and that is largely due to again the historical nature of contract pricing in these countries. And to my mind, and I'm willing to be challenged on this in the discussion, it has a lot to do also with the political approach to how energy markets should be run in many of these countries. Central Europe still has an element of regulated pricing. It is relatively low in the scheme of things, but it is also stable. It is not declining. Let's move on now to how I look at various criteria to determine how the hubs have developed. I'm not going to show you all of this today, only 2 of them, but in my paper there will be a lot of detail. And there are 5 key elements that I analyze. These are objective criteria. This is published data. There are also some other elements which are more subjective. For instance, the political willingness, the cultural attitude, things like that. All that will be in my paper. If you're interested, you can download it in a couple of months' time free of charge from the Institute website. But in order to evaluate the depth, liquidity and transparency of the traded hubs, I look at who trades, who are the market participants, what type of participant are involved, what products are traded there, is it just spot products, prompt products, or are people risk managing by using OTC and derivatives further forward along the curve, how much volume is traded over which periods, ICIS Heron Tradability Index, and the churn rate, which I think is probably the most important, because in that one criterion you encapsulate pretty much all of the others. So let's have a look at just 2. One is the traded volumes. You can't deny the figures. As I say to you, this is a bit of a crowded slide and tabled. You don't need to look at the absolute figures right now. Just look at the colors. At the top, you've got NBP and TTF. NBP is by far and away ahead of the other hubs. TTF is catching up fast. This here is total traded volume. It is OTC and exchange. You may have seen some reports recently saying that TTF has exceeded NBP in volumes. That is only on the OTC market. On the exchange market, over half, 55%, of all trading at the NBP is now done at the exchange. So when you add the 2 together, NBP is still the leading market. TTF has risen quickly. The German markets and Zeebrugge are thereabouts in the middle, in orange, and then the rest of the hubs are in red. If we look at churn rates, a very quick proviso to make here. I've been in the commodity markets for over 35 years. When I started in the early 80s, one of the first things my mentor training me said to me, if you move from market to market, you go into a new market, commodity market that you don't know anything about, the first and probably the only question you should ask is, what is the churn rate? And in the response to that, it immediately tells you how busy the market is, how many participants there are. And as a general rule of thumb, commodity markets are deemed to be mature if the churn rate is in excess of 10. Now, in natural gas in Europe, we have a peculiarity, and that's called the long-term contracts. And in a lot of the data that you will see published, these are excluded from the data as though they are some special, a different commodity. The way I view it, especially if we are going along the gas target model of all gas eventually being exchanged at hubs, then potentially all gas could be traded at hubs. And as someone coming from a trading background, I would like to include absolutely all the gas that it flows through a system in calculating the churn rates. However, again, in my paper, you can read more about that. But here I'm presenting to you the EU's definition of a churn rate, which is the traded volumes divided by the amount of gas consumed in a market area. So that does not include the exports. And therefore, by definition, the gas that has come in but then gets exported to the next country in the transit pipeline. However, even if we use that narrower definition, you can see it by the color scheme that NBP, very much up there as a mature market, nearly 3 times the standard 10 times threshold. TTF on that definition in the last few years has climbed enormously and already exceeded the 10-fold in 2011. That was the first year it exceeded it, and that is now at over 36 times consumption. So that really is quite significant. The Zeebrugge hub is the next best hub. It has been at around 5 times churn for most of its history, 10, 15-year history now, and all the other hubs are very, very low. Let me move on now just to the summary and conclusion. A lot has happened in gas markets globally. We know North America started the process. Britain then started liberalizing its markets in the mid-1990s. It has a very successful NBP benchmark hub. It reached maturity within 10 years, but at a high cost. Market participants, particularly the buyers, bought themselves out of longer-term contracts. It cost a lot of money. Other costs were involved. West European gas markets really started in the mid-2000s, and despite a successful TTF hub, are still some way from being fully liberalized across all of the countries. And in the East European gas markets, realistically, they have barely started in the last couple of years their evolution towards liberalized competitive markets. However, through EU directives, through commercial pressure, they will change in time. So the final conclusion is there in the bold blue at the bottom. NBP is the sterling benchmark hub. TTF is the euro benchmark hub. I believe that further down the line you could see another European hub as a benchmark. It is feasible. However, I will warn against this idea that everyone has to have a really a liquid hub. It is impossible. And the more hubs you have, the more you spread the liquidity, and therefore the less reliable they become as a price marker for the underlying physical contracts, because that's really what it's all about. I suppose we have to distinguish here, and it will come up in the discussion, what the definition of a hub is. Is it a physical hub where you're looking at flows of gas, a bit like Baumgarten, CGH, or is it a financial hub where transactions are done which are setting a price? And to just keep Austria as an example, that is the VTP, the virtual trading point, and that is different to CGH. So just to make that difference. But as I say, you don't want to dilute the liquidity. For me, the EU's vision of a single energy market, it probably will get there in the end, but I believe it's still many years off. Thank you.